Congressman Schiff, I've been thinking about all of the op-eds that I've read from you in the last few months that you've published in the Washington Post and the Atlantic and others, and you've made very plain your concerns about autocracy creeping in westernized democracies. And I want to say that, since World War II, as everyone in this room knows, both Republican and Democratic presidents have sought to be a bulwark against authoritarianism and attacks on freedom, trying to lead by example, promoting democracy building for better or for worse, not always with perfect results. But let me ask you, are those days over?
No, they're certainly not over. I don't think it's any surprise that in the United States we're going through a tough patch, much like Europe is. We have two branches of government tussling over foreign policy, the executive branch as well as Article 1, the legislative branch. In Article 1, there is, I think, very strong bipartisan uniform support for democracy, human rights, freedom of the press, freedom of expression. That is not always reflected in the views of the president. And this comes at a critical time when autocracy really is on the rise. I think for those of us that grew up in the post-World War II generation, we had this belief that the trend towards further democratization, with year after year more people living in free society, more people able to practice their faith, to write what they will, say what they will, love whom they would, was somehow inexorable, that, as Martin Luther King said, the moral arc of the universe may be long, but it bends towards justice. It felt like it was always bending towards greater, more liberal democracy and representative government, only to find out there was nothing inexorable about it. And we're at an inflection point. And it really requires all of us to be champions of democracy and human rights, this expectation that somehow this was on autopilot proved to be a dangerous expectation. So I think what you were seeing is the Congress in appearances like this, which are very bipartisan, in the Munich Security Conference where we had the largest bipartisan delegation ever, the Congress asserting itself and making sure that we reinforce around the world that America remains committed to democracy, to human rights, to freedom of expression. And even though we don't always see that reflected in statements coming out of the White House, that is very much the conviction of the representatives of the people in the United States. And we are going to be its champions.
You mean representatives from both parties, you're underlining?
Yes, without a question, without a question. And I think that all of us understand the tremendous benefit that democratic life has brought to us post-World War II. It's scary talking to the younger generation, for which World War II is an ancient memory, not even a memory for them, but ancient history, and to hear young people begin to question democracy. And it was interesting to see that Dalia poll, which showed continuing.
Yes, I'd actually like if we could put up on the screen one of the Dalia slides, which looks at the split over whether the U.S. helps or hurts democracy around the world. Is that the slide you're referring to?
Well, yes, but even more so the continuing support for democracy at a time when people are wondering about the commitment to democracy. This slide was quite chilling, I have to say, as an American. Glad to see we're just killing it in Nigeria. But
it is interesting that Nigeria and Kenya think we're great, and I wonder whether some of that has to do with, President George W. Bush gets a lot of credit for his PEPFAR program, for having promoted that throughout Africa, and supposedly thereby boosting America's popularity, according to all the sort of longitudinal polling I've seen on this, boosting America's perception in Africa. And I wonder whether that's part of it or what that's about. I don't know.
It's not a perfect parallel, but it is indicative that where we are viewed as most supportive of democracy also, I think, largely overlaps with countries where we're the most popular, and in countries where we're not, where we're viewed with skepticism.
Look at Austria. They really don't like us. Are you stopping in Vienna on this trip?
I guess we should add Austria to the itinerary.
Yeah.
Yes, we have some
You
work
guys
to
have
do
some
there.
talking to do. And Germany also is surprising.
It is. Well, it is surprising, and it's obviously disturbing for us to see among our strongest allies such profound concern over whether we are a force for good in terms of promotion of democracy or we're part of the problem. I really do think that much as the idea has been disparaged from time to time, we do continue to play an indispensable role. As my colleague Tom Cole was saying earlier, people around the world who are they're journalists watching from their prison cells in Turkey, or they're freedom and democracy advocates under house arrest in Egypt, or they're the families that are the victims of a campaign of mass extrajudicial killing in the Philippines. They're not going to look to Russia for help. They're not going to look to China for help. They do continue to look to America. And Europe, with all of its turmoil over Brexit, is also not able to step easily into that role. And so we still have an indispensable part to play. And we will play it again once we get through this. But
get through this, you mean get through our own problems?
Get through our own problems, yes. And I think those problems, they certainly predate this administration. I wouldn't lay this, solely at the feet of the president. I think they're the product of two revolutions going on simultaneously around the world. A revolution in the global economy, in which people are losing their jobs through no fault of their own, just by dint of technology and globalization. And I think that revolution is every bit as significant as the Industrial Revolution, and we are in the early stage of it, so it's going to become more profound before it becomes less. And we're in a revolution in communication, which you discussed earlier in the day, where through social media, which is now the news source for most people, lies travel far faster than truths. Fear and anger literally go viral. And you put those two disruptive forces together, either one of which would be enough for any society to cope with, and I think you get enormous turmoil. And that turmoil has been reflected in this kind of xenophobic populism. And the tendency, I guess, of human beings throughout time when things are difficult to fall back on tribe. And so, yes, we are going through that like much of the rest of the world. And we all need to figure this out together. Because we have seen throughout history when the economic challenges become too much, it can lead to devastating consequences. So yes, we will get, I have every confidence we will get through this, but it's not fun while it lasts.
It's interesting to hear you say that you are confident that the United States will come back and play a key leadership role in terms of encouraging democracy, being a beacon, and also a helper. Because of course there are some in the U.S. government, including the president has expressed some isolationist views during his campaign in particular, saying we don't need to be the world's policeman, we don't need to be doing everything else for the world, we have our own problems at home. And that message, which was heard from candidate Trump and to a lesser degree from candidate Bernie Sanders, is something that I think activated something in Americans who felt like we need to deal with our problems at home. So how do you, as a congressman who represents a district in California, you need to serve your constituents who are worried about infrastructure, they're worried about income inequality, they're worried about migration on our border, they're worried about so many things. How do you convince Americans from both parties and independents that this matters, that the role, this sort of, let's say, transatlantic or certainly the American notion in the Cold War and post-era, that we are somehow this indispensable beacon for democracy, the shining city on the hill? How do you convince ordinary Americans that that matters, or that they should be putting their taxpayer resources into that when we have our own problems at home?
Well, in California, I think it's fairly easy sell because we are a very diverse state. We have a very large immigrant population. There isn't the same fear of immigration or migration because people are immigrants, or they're the near descendants of immigrants, and their neighbors are immigrants, and they realize just how much of a productive force in the community and the economy immigration is. But they also, because they come from other places, and they've had other experiences, they realize just how blessed they are to be in a place that enjoys freedom, that has the opportunity to choose who would represent them. There is a fatigue in the country, which I think is something that the president tapped into. There's a fatigue after almost 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, seeing so much of the nation's resources, blood and treasure go into these foreign conflicts. There is a desire to rebuild at home. But there's always been, and it persists today, and it will persist in the future, there's always been a recognition of the importance and the desire to be a world leader, a pride in American leadership around the world, a pride in being a superpower that I think no American wants to abdicate, and a sense of responsibility about it. You can certainly frame it in a pejorative way and say we don't want to be the world's policeman. But if you ask Americans, do you want to be the world leader? They'll say yes. So I think this dramatic change we're seeing, change in people's jobs and their retirement and concerns over their children's future, has caused Americans to turn inward. But nonetheless, I think there's a great sense of purpose among Americans and a recognition that we have tried to wall ourselves off from the world's problems in the past, and they have come roaring to our shores.
Yeah, that didn't work out so well. So let's flip the perspective from the perspective of ordinary Americans to the perspective of others in the world and how they view us and whether we can be productive and helpful. I noticed that the third country on the list was our own host country, Denmark, and we're underwater in Denmark, it seems, at minus 33% in terms of views of whether America is helpful or harmful to democracy. I wonder whether part of that is because of the prolonged Iraq war and what was seen as maybe ham-handed attempts to democracy build by the United States. I'd love to hear your perspective from the inside of why you think that's happening. When you go on a congressional delegation to Europe, what do you hear from our partners and our allies? I mean, these are NATO allies who are not thinking we're doing so well for democracy. And how do you persuade them, yes, we made mistakes, but we're going to do better?
Well, Denmark has been such an important partner, and young men and women from this country have fought beside our soldiers in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I tend to think that's less of the issue in terms of Denmark's view about whether we're a productive force vis-a-vis democracy than maybe other issues like our walking away from the climate accord, which is of such great consequence here. When we did that, that was an abdication of American leadership on an issue of global significance, but particular significance here. I'm sure it's also...
or walking away from the Iran deal.
Or walking away from the Iran deal. That obviously is another flashpoint and becoming all the more dangerous. But look, there's a concern in Denmark and elsewhere, and there's a concern among many of us in the United States when we look around the world and we see foreign despots quoting our president, ridiculing their own press that is holding them accountable, what little free press some of these countries still have.
We're picking up on the language, copying the language, saying enemy of the people and fake news.
Exactly. And, for a world that's used to proponents of democracy and human rights quoting the President of the United States, to see now despots doing it is deeply distressing to us and to a lot of our allies. But I do tend to think that these issues are intermixed, that if you tend to think based on America's role in climate or America's position on the JCPOA or other issues that America is not leading in the right direction, then you're going to tend to think it's not a force for good vis-a-vis democracy at large.
I want to remind the audience that we welcome your questions. You may get to see the chairman on television programs and maybe sitting in your living room shouting out what you want to ask him. So this is your chance to actually ask him. So don't forget to tap your app to put in your questions. You can do it also on the Facebook live feed, and you can send a Facebook message to Alliance of Democracies. So what I'm hearing from you, Chairman, is that there is this Goldilocks conundrum that, how much should the U.S. do to push back against authoritarian and strongman states? And I'm thinking everything from Russia to Venezuela to Hungary and the Philippines. We want to do good, not harm, but I think that there's also times when we're perceived as meddling, ineffective, feckless. So how do we get that balance right?
Well, and one country I would very much add to your list, because it's among the most significant propagators of a new form of autocracy, is China. And one of the profound concerns that we ought to have about China is not only the degree to which now it is using technology to perpetuate a totalitarian kind of rule through the use of ubiquitous CCTV cameras in big cities, the synchronization of those cameras with big data analytics and people's social media feeds and who's coming to visit them and where they're traveling. But they're exporting that technology to other countries that will help other autocratic regimes perpetuate their autocracy.
Are you referring somewhat to the Huawei technology as well?
Well, Huawei is a somewhat different issue. Huawei is a security threat because it will allow China to tap into people's private data, but rather the so-called the Orwellian-sounding safe cities technologies that it is exporting, including, I think, to some of these places behind me.
Although interesting, London has that Big Brother camera system, which I think most of us were unaware of until the London terrorist attacks. And they were able to capture so many images of those bus terrorists through the cameras.
Yes, and in the United States, there are any number of cities that have deployed CCTV cameras. The question is whether those societies have precautions in place in terms of people's private data, or they don't. In China, there are no protections. And to many of the autocratic regimes, they're deploying this technology. There are also no protections. In terms of the United States and what's our role and how do we successfully push back against this rise of authoritarianism, how do we work with other countries in a way that is not considered meddling? There are countries that are emerging democracies that affirmatively want our assistance. And in fact, we have a partnership between the Congress and emerging democracies that my colleague David Price chairs, and which we work collaboratively. And there you have to be diplomatic in terms of how you recommend what we're doing or not doing. Then there are other countries where it is considered quite hostile to be advancing these issues. I'll never forget a meeting that I had with Mubarak some years ago, and I was part of a congressional delegation, and we talked about the usual constellation of defense issues and terrorism issues, etc. But at the end of our meeting, we raised the issue of the detention of Saeed Ibrahim, an American who was a liberal opponent of Mubarak's politically. Now, he was no threat politically. He had no real base in Egypt, but that didn't stop Mubarak from incarcerating him. And his wife had come to us to ask us to intercede, and we did. The entire tenor of the conversation changed the minute we brought up Saeed Ibrahim or the issue of human rights or freedom in Egypt. Mubarak made it very plain that he was very happy to have U.S. assistance. He was very happy to have a U.S.-Egypt relationship. But when it came to what he considered Egyptian domestic affairs, we could butt the hell out and not let the door hit us in the backside on the way out. That was our mistake, I think, historically, to allow countries like Egypt to think that we would not bother them.
It's still happening. Look at Saudi Arabia, and President Trump was quite cozy with Mohammed bin Salman at the G20 today. I'm sure you've seen those images.
Oh, it's been a persistent issue. That is, How forcefully do you advocate for human rights and democracy? And, it's been a concern since the beginning of this administration that it might not even be an item on the agenda. It needs to be an item on the agenda. Countries take notice of whether the issue is brought up. We saw just within the last 24 hours in a meeting with Putin,
We actually have a question on this. What are your thoughts on Trump's remarks during his bilat with Putin?
And I didn't even look at the screen. Well, horrified. What we need the president to do is to firmly push back and let Putin understand in no uncertain terms that if he meddles again in our election, there will be the most serious of consequences. If they don't like the sanctions that we've imposed on them now, they've seen nothing yet. That's the kind of message we need delivered, not they want me to ask you about whether you meddled or tell you not to meddle. You're not going to meddle, right? Like it's a joke. It's not a joke. It's not a joke. As Bob Mueller made so pointedly clear when he spoke about a month or so ago, and this he raised at the beginning of his comments and at the end, the Russians interfered in a systemic way in our democracy. This is no laughing matter.
Well, you've spent, 2 years almost on an investigation of the Russian interference, and you have some conclusions. You've now got a breakthrough in that Robert Mueller is going to testify on July 17th. What is it that you want the American people and the guests here to know about Russian interference? Because it's not just like it's a moment in history in 2016 and that's done. It happened again in France. It happened again in Germany. It happened in Brexit before our election. And I'm sure you must be concerned it's going to happen again in 2020.
Well, I am. And in terms of what I would like our European friends to understand, they understood it before we did because they were the victims of Russia meddling even before we were. It was a great shock to us because we hadn't experienced that level of Russian intervention in our elections, I think, ever. But in terms of the American elections, they've never stopped. They had two operations in 2016. They had the social media operation and they had the hacking and dumping operation.
And now deepfakes may be part of it in 2020?
Well, I don't
know if you saw the Trump deepfake this morning that was done.
I didn't, but we had a hearing on deepfakes in the Intel committee just a month ago, because this is one of my paramount concerns for 2020, and that is in 2016, when we were watching the Russian interference in real time, we were watching them releasing these stolen documents, I was most concerned that among the authentic documents, they were going to start dumping forgeries. They would take an email, a real email between two Clinton campaign workers that was 2 paragraphs long, and they would add a third paragraph suggesting illegality. Had that been done 2-3 weeks before the election, it would have been impossible to disprove and could very well have been determinative. Now, what they did anyway may have been determinative, we'll never know. But the capacity for disruption with a fraudulent document of that incendiary nature was tremendous. Now that threat is exponentially greater with this deepfake technology. The state of the art is good enough to fool anyone looking with a naked eye. And so it is, I think, far less risky for the Russians to insert into the social media ecosystem, and they could do it here in Copenhagen, or they could do it in London, or they could do it in the Republic of Georgia, a video of a Democratic candidate for president saying something they never said. And you would look at that video and you would say, okay, that's him, or that's her, and that's their voice. You would not be able to tell that it's a fake. And in our polarized world... So what are you
doing about it? In a quick answer, as we're running out of time. What are you doing about it?
We are, one, trying to do the public education campaign. There are deceptions coming your way. They're going to be very convincing. You need to look at trusted sources of news. You need to be more skeptical. But here's the problem with that. It's not a complete answer, because there's also, as one of our witnesses described during our hearing, the liar's dividend. That is, not only can things be put forward as true that are fake, things that are true can be labeled as fake. And we have that problem already in spades.
And it's rare for politicians to think ahead and protect themselves in the kind of wild but canny way that Emmanuel Macron did by putting out a bunch of emails that were mixed fake and real. So you didn't know what was real and what was fake. I mean, they had that as their sort of protection in the back of their pocket.
Well, I think all campaigns are going to have to think about how they can have a fast response to pushing out a fraudulent content. But the other thing we can do and are doing, both at a government level as well as the private sector, is developing the technologies to detect a deep fake. But even that is imperfect, because you'll have one expert saying that this video that now everybody has seen, millions have seen, when they run it through their computer analysis, is clearly fraudulent. And you'll have some other potentially faux expert saying it's real. And in an environment in which you can't tell what is true, people fall back on their political party or their group as a proxy
their unconscious
for truth.
Bias and their instinct.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, well, we have to wrap up, so I want to give the last word to one of our audience members who asked the question, how do you make sure when the U.S. tries to promote democracy abroad that it's doing so in the interest of the public of that country? So give us a quick, pithy answer to our audience member who's concerned about that.
Well, we wrestle with this with countries like Iran, for example. Is democracy promotion in Iran productive? Or can the Iranian government, can the mullahs simply use that against the whole principle by labeling it as some vast conspiracy of Western agitators? So it's going to be country specific, but I think the best thing we can do, frankly, is provide a good example to make sure that we protect our free press, that we are living up to our own values. That's probably the best thing that we can do. And with respect to others, I think we have to show humility, and now more than ever. We've been at this for a couple hundred years. We still haven't gotten it perfectly right, and in fact, you can see our mistakes on ample display, but I wouldn't have it any other way. And so I think the best we can do is try to be a good example.
Well, please join me in thanking Congressman Schiff for sharing his views with us.